I really shouldn't put too much effort into these tier lists, but meh. I'll note that QualityOldGames recently basically did like a tier list for Numidia here, and as you can see, I'm recording this about 14 hours after he basically put this up. But the tier list he made, it had one glaring issue for me. You can't tell the long shield cavalry from the early bodyguard. I mean, I can. This is the early bodyguard right here, and then that's like the late general, but I still want to basically differentiate it, so to speak. So that's what I did. Made new tier list, and the general stars basically right there dictate which basically is like the general, and which is like not a general, so to speak. All right, so much like last time, I basically went through like all the units basically here on like an Excel sheet, and basically sort of like took some time to think about like how much value basically put in like each of the roles, basically like a sort of value for each of these like type of units. And we're just going to go from there. So starting with the peasant. I'll note that much like with like the Roman peasants, these guys are still like awesome for garrison, awesome for procurement, awesome for usage, but they don't really have much use basically outside of those roles. So they're a very average unit, they're laudable, they do their job, and you can't really basically like hate them too much for like what they basically do. But that's basically all they do. So they're just laudable. That's all I can really say about them. I don't think I really need to say much more than that. Alright, Desert Infantry is next. So, I basically recently played the Numidia campaign, and I found Desert Infantry to be like, actually a fairly decent unit to basically use. They're not really like, really good for garrison, but at the same time, you're not really like, worrying about garrison with Numidia. I'll note that basically in my campaign with like, Numidia, I actually had like a couple of summons basically fall. Actually a few summons fall. And it's because like Egypt basically came to like the west from like, their settlements and basically like took all of like, Siwa, Cyrene, and I think I made all the way up to like Lepus Magna before I basically stopped them. And the thing is like, you're not really defending with Numidia, so I mean you could use like these guys as sort of like, fortune attack, but I mean, you're probably like more so like, basically sort of be like, running around like, in a very like sort of like horse type of fashion with this like faction early on. Eventually, basically at Lepus Magna, after I like carved and like Phapsis, that's basically what happened. I moved all my forces basically down to sort of counter the Egyptian threat and like sort of knocked them back to like essentially to Siwa at that point. But I mean like garrison's not really that important, I don't think, for Numidia until like well, never, because they're basically on a roll and she's basically on a roll, so there's just that. But basically like I don't think they're like gonna be that useful for it, just for a simple reason that they're like $200 basically like a full unit to sort of like keep around in like your settlement. And even though they do add like a little bit of like defensive value to like basically holding off like forces on a tower and stuff like that, they're not really like legionnaires or anything like that, so they're not the greatest at. They can be sort of useful against cavalry, but I mean you want like a an actual like hoplite unit or something like that to sort of do that. So hire those instead. There is like some hot places around it, basically higher on like Sicily if you get up there. Overall, the thing about the Desert Infantry that makes them like sort of stand out is just the fact that they're very like beefy units. They have very good morale, fairly decent like combat abilities like against like non-sword wielding units. They're pretty easy to like procure because they only require like the same sort of barracks that the Hesai basically need. And I basically use these guys basically all the time as like my sort of like anvil, so to speak. A lot of times basically like with the Numidia, you're gonna be using like your infantry to sort of like just be like a sort of like wall for like the enemy infantry to slam against by your cavalry. So yeah, can't really complain about like their usage. They feel tactic. They're fun to use basically, even if like you aren't using it for that, because I made like a lot of use basically of these guys just charging like summons basically to sort of like mop up stuff. And even though they're not like the best thing for it, they still did a fairly good job in a lot of places. So overall, definitely an A rank like excellent unit. So I'm happy for them. Now, the Numidian Legionnaire is basically next, and you basically sort of probably saw it, but these guys I sort of rank as mediocre. They are technically better than like the Desert Infantry, but the thing about these guys is that I found that like they're very hard to sort of procure. Basically, the thing about Numidian Legionnaires is that you need to have like an army barracks or equivalent. So best basically tier 4 barracks. And that basically takes like a lot of money basically to sort of get up to. Basically sort of make use of. And the thing is, like, the tier, like, 2 barracks basically gets you, like, the dozen infantry, and tier 3 basically upgrades the dozen infantry. You're probably better off basically, like, sticking dozen infantry just because they're easier to sort of, like, essentially replenish if, like, you don't have any, like, army barracks based around to sort of, like, make use of. The other thing about Legionnaires is to take, like, 2 turns to basically train. And, that basically, like, makes it a little bit harder to sort of, like, get up and running if you want to basically, like, get an army of these guys. In the end, I did, like, have, like, a fair amount of these guys to, like, make use of, and they were very useful for, like, fighting against, like, say, Romans, basically in their, like, summons like that, but, they're not basically as, like, useful as, say, like, the Desert Infantry is, like, because they're, like, 2-turn training, like, this higher replenishment ability, so to speak, because, you need that, like, tier 4 barracks for them, so, mediocre. Alright, now, that's basically it for, like, their, like, infantry for, like, Numidia. Note that basically for, like, the Numidian, like, faction, they probably have, like, the least amount of, like, melee units, just for a simple reason that, like, well, I shouldn't say that, there's also Parthia, but the thing about Numidia is that they don't really have a whole lot of, like, units basically in the roster, and, outside of, like, these, like, 2 ones right here, they're, like, only able to, basically train, like, Javelin, which is basically, like, a range unit in their, like, their barracks, so I guess we'll talk about them basically next. So I'll note that basically the Numidian Javelin is basically, like, the equivalent of, like, a Town Watch or, like, Warband. And while basically they aren't, like, the worst, like, Javelin men basically out there, I still basically consider them deficient. Now, I will say I actually use these quite a bit early on because you're in Numidia. You basically have to use, like, everything under the sun to sort of keep yourself alive. Basically, the thing about them is that they're, like, a very early sort of, like, range unit to sort of, like, pepper, like, say, like, elephants from, like, Carthage, or, like, throw into, like, the backs of, like, the Romans if they basically, like, keep themselves open to you. The thing about Javelin is that they're not very, like, strong, basically, to, like, harass enemies with, and they don't have a lot of ammo, so I don't really like using them for that purpose. They do have, like, their purpose basically for Numidia, and, like, they are basically, like, the equivalent of Town Watches, which is basically different from the other factions. All other factions basically in the game, like, that use, like, Peltis, they require you to basically, like, get, like, a, tier 1 archery range, so these are, like, a little bit easier to procure as a result of that, but, overall, I would say, like, the Javelin men are basically something that, like, I probably would, like, not build most of the time, and the only reason I basically use Javelin men in, like, my, like, campaigns is because you basically start with so many of them with, like, Numidia. Like, basically all their, like, their cities will basically have, like, a Javelin men basically in it, so you have a lot of these great guys to work with, but, they're not that great to sort of, like, worry about, I don't think. And to some extent, the same as with the archers here. So, I'll note basically for, like, the archers, I basically rate them as being, like, laudable. But at the same time, they're, like, worse than, like, say, peasants for, like, what they're basically offering. So, let's put them right there. Now, I'll note that basically with archers in this game, they do have, like, one big advantage basically over, like, other archers from, like, other factions. And that's the simple thing is that, like, you can basically build archers for, like, a tier 1, like, archer range. So, basically, sort of like with their Javelin men, they basically have, like, 1 tier lower in order to basically get access to these, like, archers. And, if you want to basically have archer units basically sort of run around with, then they're okay for, like, basically doing their job. But, the thing about them is that, like, you don't really need a whole lot of archers basically like the media, because you're not really basically sort of like, a stationary sort of like, solid, like, flanking sort of type of faction. You basically don't, like go up to the enemy as a block of units, basically, so it's really hard to sort of, like, basically use archers to sort of, like, harass an enemy. You can use these guys basically if you want to, and I actually make use of them against, like, Egypt, for example, because, chariot archers, these guys will, like, get through your defense of the chariot archers, like, even if they take, like, lots of casualties basically doing it, they'll still do a lot of, like, damage regardless, so they have their uses, but, overall, they're, like, not the greatest thing. And just to sort of, like, just get these out of the way, slingers and onagers. Easily the worst 2 units basically, I think, in the roster for, like, Numidia. And to sort of, like, talk about them a little bit here. The thing is, like, you may want to get archers basically for, like, a little bit of range support for your guys. But after you basically get to, like, a tier 2 and tier 3, like, archer range and the catapult range for, like, Numidia, you're only basically getting like slingers and onagers. And these are basically like the crappy slingers that basically all the other factions basically get to have like very short range and like, basically hit the, the backs of your, like your guys' heads, maybe basically like, are trying to like, help them out if you're not careful. And then there's like the onagers basically just a siege weapon, so use those against walls, and that's basically all you can really use them for because it's not really useful in like a battlefield sort of setting. But the thing about the slingers, by the way, is that like, they're not really all that special, and you probably can like get away with this without using like the archers. And if you're basically not gonna like build it for like a tier 3 like archer range, it's not really worth buying for like the like onagers either. So yeah, basically these are like the worst units basically to sort of like procure. I probably like not even borrow these guys, so for the most part, I think they're basically fine in the terrible rank, and I think that's basically where they're gonna go. And that's basically it for like all the like the missile units. And notice how fast just like video's basically going because like there's not a whole lot basically cover here. But well, it's still 5 more units, so let's get to them. And we're finally gonna get to like the real stars of the show. Start of this guy, the fantastic Numidian Cavalry. All right, so I'll note that Numidian Cavalry are basically what probably comes to mind with like Numidia, and they don't disappoint. These guys will basically carry you through like the early game and probably will until like the mid game and perhaps the end game if you want to as well. The chief thing that makes the Numidian Cavalry basically stand out is the fact that they basically have like very high morale for like a peltis on like cavalry type of unit, and at the same time they're basically like also very proficient with their javelins. I'm not sure they're basically the best like missile like javelin throwing the cavalry. I think there's like some Pontic ones that are a little bit better, but at the same time these guys basically like will do a really good job, and they're very easy to sort of like recruit because you only need like a tier 1 stable space to get them. Unlike say like the Romans, who basically need like a tier 2 or some of the other factions as well. They're definitely better than like the militia cavalry for like the Greeks, so there's that going for them as well. So overall, they're basically like there's a star unit, and this is sort of like give you an idea of like how useful these guys basically are. Early game, basically what you want to do with these guys is sort of like just harass like the enemy with them. Like I'll basically send like a full army of like a doom stack of just like these guys that are like an army, and even though I'm not like intent to like, sort of like win the battle, I can use them to sort of like snipe generals or like harass like specifically like challenging units basically sort of get them out of the way. And if I want to retreat, then I retreat, and like I take my casualties basically like as I got them, basically so to speak, without taking too many of my own. Now they are basically vulnerable to archer fire and like other stuff like that, but at the same time, if you make good use of these guys, they can basically just like win campaigns. And I'll give you an example. For example, I basically sent like a half stack I think of like this Numidian like cavalry up to basically attack Spain, and I basically actually like for most part take like the first like settlements of like Corduba, and after I basically took Corduba, I basically held out against like the like approaching like attacks of the Spanish to try and retake their city. And after enough time, basically like establishing something in Corduba, I was able to sort of like push out and like just take the rest of the cities from there. So I definitely like fully like these guys for what they basically offer. Not so much the Numidian Cavalry though. Those guys I don't really care much about. So these guys are another deficient unit. Now some people basically say like these guys do serve a purpose against like enemy cavalry units. Like say for example, might send against like say Roman generals or against like say the Seleucid or like Parthian like heavy cavalry. But the thing is like these guys are not very useful like outside of those sort of situations. And I mean they do have a tactic basically going after those guys, but against everything else, like say like against infantry or against like say like just running down like chasing down like running enemies, they're not that useful basically. I'd rather basically like say like have like the long shield cavalry, which is basically like the same cost and can recruit and like replenish everywhere. And that's basically another thing to note about these guys. I actually probably like rank these guys a little bit too high perhaps. But the thing about the Numidian Cavalry Riders is that like they require you basically have a camel resource in order to like build them. And you may not have access to that basically everywhere on a map. You know what? Let's just say like we'll do it like this. Whoops, I put it a little too low. So, yeah, they serve like they serve a purpose, but well, I shouldn't say that, should I? No, that's fine. The thing about like the Numidian Cavalry is that like because they require like camels basically to recruit, you have to basically like recruit them basically say like Carthage or like your capital, or say like down like Thebes, or like some of the are like camel places in basically like Asia, and sort of like get them. And that can be really challenging if like you're basically trying to attack like Europe, for example. So you might like initially take these guys over, sort of like mop up like say like a general, or try and use them in mass to go after say like the slave states or something like that. But I mean, I'd rather basically like not really like borrow from them, so to speak, because outside like where basically they're recruitable, they're just hard to sort of replenish. And you can basically get the same thing with long shield cavalry, which are basically like usually just as useful for most part in a lot of areas. Plus, I didn't really go after like the solid states or anything like that, so maybe I'm a little bit biased for that reason. But I really don't think my shield cavalry riders. It's not the worst unit, but I mean, they have deficiencies, so to speak. All right, so that's basically it for like the camels. So long shield cavalry. These guys I consider to be like essentially on par of like the Numidian Cavalry, a little bit worse perhaps, but still pretty good. Now I'm not basically after like my initial like early campaign where like say like Numidian Cavalry to sort of like mop up the Spanish, and like I also use them against like the Egyptians as well, so because like it's really hard to sort of catch like these guys with like the chariots, so you can sort of like use them sort of like to take out the chariots, and like that's this one way of like cavalry building chariots if you want to, I guess, in that sort of situation. But I guess like say I guess against the Romans, for example, I use like these like long shield cavalry guys over here. Long shield cavalry are basically very useful because you can basically use them sort of like hammer and anvil like troops, which is basically what I did to like the Romans quite a bit. And en masse, they basically sort of wipe out like a Roman general quite easily, and like you can basically do a lot of like fun stuff with them, so to speak. And basically like for like the end part of my campaign, after like I harass people like the Numidian javelin, I still use like the Numidian cavalry basically sort of like to harass stuff. But after basically their javelins basically really worn out, I basically send these guys basically in and sort of like mop them up in a lot of places, and it worked quite well. So like 1-2 punch them in a lot of ways. So I end up using these guys quite a bit in my like campaign, and they did their job pretty well. So they definitely deserve high marks, and that's why I give them like the second place right after Numidian cavalry. All right, the bodyguards. Now I will make one confession to you guys right here. In my campaign, I never actually got to see the Numidian armored bodyguard in action, and part of the reason I never actually really got to see him is because I didn't let the Marius reforms happen. I basically charged up like the Italian peninsula before like Rome basically got underway with that, so I was able basically to take Patavium before like any like trouble basically happened. And after all of that, no Marian reforms. And also note by the way, something about my Numidian campaign. It was also my first campaign where I actually wiped out the entire Roman like roster. Like I wiped out the Scipii first, then I wiped out the Julii, and then I wiped out the Brutii. And somewhere along the way, I wiped out the Sen as well. So all 4 factions were basically killed during my like Numidian campaign. So yeah, never really got around to it because like I just wiped them out. Hooray! Anyways, as you can see, like we got basically an A and I got a C here. So A and C. Now, the reason I basically rank these guys basically as is, early on, you don't really have access to like the long shield cavalry, so these guys basically sort of pick up the slack basically, where like you don't really have like a it's like a heavy fighting force basically like the guys. You may want to basically use like say like your bodyguard basically charge into like a weakened enemy unit to sort of like try and finish him off or break him, and that's basically what I do a lot with like my bodyguard unit. And you also basically want to sort of use them to sort of like buff morale and do stuff like that, of course. So there's still that as well. And again, of course, in the garrison for a city, these guys will help like manage like your like population and stuff like that. So pretty important for that. Overall, fantastic unit. So it's a general. You can't really complain about it. Now, I do think that the armed bodyguard would be a little bit weaker than them, by the way, just to throw it out there. The thing about the armed bodyguard is that basically once you get into like the late campaign, you're probably not really focused too much on basically using like your armed bodyguards to sort of like essentially like do battles and stuff like that, but rather just to police your cities and sort of keep the peace. Actually, I was like finally like later on, I've been using like say my Numidian Cavalry to just like headset went off there for a little bit, but I basically found like basically later on in the game, I basically like was keeping my like generals basically back and like some of my Numidian Cavalry basically in and sort of like snipe off enemy generals and only basically sending these guys basically in with like mass like killer armies basically for like legionnaires and like doesn't infantry to like wipe out the Romans and stuff like that. And defense like we're basically like using like hit and run tactics. You don't want to use generals because they might suffer a result of that. So you don't want to basically have losses for your generals, so you keep them back. And for most part, you probably don't want to use your generals basically as an armed bodyguard for like an actual unit basically at that point. So that's basically justification, basically saying they're probably a little bit lower as like resolve that. And yeah, that's basically my sort of like roster. And as you can see, it's a very like solid split of like 2 with like most of like these like cavalry units basically on top. Doesn't infantry basically right there being an exception. You got like the peasants, the archers, legionnaires, late bodyguard. I kind of find funny I put my like late units like these guys all the way over here, but I mean it kind of serves a purpose. Like they have their purpose, but the thing about Numidia is that they're very much like an early game, like sort of like roster type of faction, where they're very strong early game, but late game they sort of like floundered a little bit because they sort of suffer basically suffering training on these guys and like stuff like that, and they don't really have any like really powerful units like they have like their camels, but slingers, onagers, no, this crappy. So I think I'm basically like just fine like saying like that's pretty much good where they basically are. Alright, so, I probably should put this in presentation mode, so, there's the presentation basically as it is. And, let's just go back to normal view. And why not? We're basically just going to save this right here, I guess, for, like, all to see. So, let's go to computer rank, let's go right here. And I'll get the detailed breakdown in a moment, but, DFuxa rakes. Numidia roster. The Numidian faction. It helps if I actually spend these, spell this right, but whatever. And don't really care. Blah blah. There's my breakdown if you want. And as always, it's very slow sometimes, basically, like, getting this thing to basically save on, like, tier list, because, my connection basically sucks. Alright, well, I'll give this basically, like, a link basically over to QualityOldGames, basically, so you can look at it, I guess. He might find some interest, basically, in, like, what is basically right here. Oops, probably should set the speed to, everyone then. And there we go. Hope you guys basically enjoyed the roster for like Numidia. Maybe you agree with it, maybe you don't. I'll note that basically QualityOldGames does actually have his own list. And I can actually go to like, actually I can't actually do this, can I? I don't think he actually saved his, so or maybe he did. He actually had like 2 lists here, by the way. So it's possibly as like, over here. Nope, he didn't rate it. So QualityOldGames, you guys save your lists. I mean, you got a YouTube video, you can go check that out, I guess, but, whatever. Alright, well, that's basically enough rambling for this video. Hope you guys basically enjoy it, and take care.